There have been warnings of a new Cold War between Russia and the European Union, with neither side seemingly willing to discuss how to end a succession of disagreements. There are sanctions, there are travel bans, diplomats from both sides have been expelled. So what will it mean if matters do not improve? This is Roundtable. Very good to have your company. I'm David Foster. One of the problems appears to be that different countries in the European Union have different relationships with Russia. And Russia has been accused of exploiting this. Is a common approach at all possible? Last month, there was shock in the Czech Republic when two Russian agents were accused of causing two explosions at an ammunition depot in 2014. As a response, the Czech government expelled 18 Russian officers. A number of other European nations, including the Baltic states, Romania and Slovakia, deported Russian diplomats in solidarity. Moscow, meanwhile, expelled 20 Czech officials working in Russia. Relations between the EU and Russia have been poor for years and haven't been helped by the jailing of the opposition leader Alexei Navalny, or the treatment of the EU's top diplomat on a trip to Moscow earlier this year. So can EU-Russia relations recover from this point? Well, I'm very pleased to be able to say that we can go to The Hague first of all on this round table, and there we see Tony van der Togt, who works at the Russia and Eastern Europe Center of the Clingendael Institute. Then we head to Slovakia, Bratislava, and joining us is Alena Kudzko, director of the GLOBSEC Policy Institute, and we welcome back Samuel Ramani, a lecturer on Russia at the University of Oxford. Tony, I'm going to start with you, but this is open to each and every one of you. How bad are things at the moment between the European Union and Russia?
Well, I think they're pretty bad. They're at the lowest point since the 1990s. And we are at the stalemate. The old relationship between the EU and Russia is not going to work anymore. The Russians also don't want it. So we have been for quite some time in this stalemate, and there is no clear way forward at the moment.
I'm not going to go into the details of why it's got to this particular point, unless you think it's necessary, but I want to examine what difficulties it presents, Tony.
Well, the main difficulties in view, well, how the EU sees this is the violation of international law, norms and standards, starting with the Ukraine crisis, with the annexation of Crimea, with the Russian military activities in eastern Ukraine. And since then, more incidents have happened, like in, with the Skripal affair in the UK, with what has recently happened in the Czech Republic, more incidents, kicking out diplomats one side and then the other reciprocates. And now around Belarus as well, as far as Russia is supporting Belarus in its own violations of human rights and keeping a repressive regime in place.
It's a very, very long list. Alena, let me come to you and ask you this. What practical difficulties does it throw up in terms of the relationship between the two?
I will follow up on what Tony was saying about this sour state of relations between the EU and Russia, but this emotional state does have very practical implication. It means it makes it very difficult to find a constructive way forward. There is a lot of disillusionment in the European Union when it comes to Russia. Bad news keep coming. There is one incident after another, and both sides seem to lose trust in whether the cooperation is even possible. And especially on the EU side, there is increasing feeling that Russia doesn't really want to cooperate in good faith. And objectively, the European Union is not entirely sure how to deal with it and what is the best way forward.
This is the point, isn't it? The European Union hasn't got a clue how to handle this, and that's partly because nobody at the moment really knows what Russia stands for. It shows so many different faces. But I want to go back a couple of years. March 2019, this was a statement from the European Parliament. Russia's intervention in Syria, interference in countries such as Libya and the Central African Republic, continuous aggressive action in Ukraine, support for anti-EU parties and far-right movements. It keeps meddling in political elections and violating human rights in its own state. It went on to say that the European Union should review its current partnership and cooperation agreement with Russia. 2 years on, Alena, nothing's changed.
It is, but that's not an easy issue to crack. And maybe part of it is psychological, that nobody really wants to deal with a difficult issue. But also the European Union has hope that it can maintain the approach to Russia that it had had in the past, and it's just a matter of time. On the one side, the European Union tried to be nicer to Russia, tried to engage a little bit. On the other side, the European Union tried to impose sanctions. But sanctions alone are not necessarily a policy, and they definitely, taken by themselves, are not going to change the course of history. So indeed, the EU has not yet elaborated on what can be this constructive way forward. The EU knows what doesn't work, probably knows now much better than 2 years ago, but still what works is still a big question mark.
Samuel, is Russia quite enjoying this in a way because it knows that there are 27 different countries pitted one against the other when it comes to their own idea of what the relationship with Russia should be, and Russia can basically stand around and sort of play one off against the other?
Exactly, yeah. So the Russian statements have effectively placed the entire onus, the entire blame for the situation on the European Union, but you've actually seen Russia exactly exploit the differences. Russia has seen Emmanuel Macron's willingness to reach out to Vladimir Putin as a show of strength, so Franco-Russian dialogue is important. It's engaged with Spain on counterterrorism just recently. Its interference in the elections is aimed at supporting the political far left and the political far right, so it's aimed at dividing European societies. And even though there was a consensus in 2014 around the imposition of sanctions, the fact that Hungary, Greece, and other European states do have residual links towards Russia, and the fact that the EU has not been able to develop a consensus on other issues, like Turkey or Gaza, suggests that Russia is going to try to bide its time and hope for an erosion of the consensus.
Go into Macron's reset with Russia in a little bit more detail for us, if you would, Samuel. What was it he set out to do, and what were the objections?
So pretty early in Macron's term, he decided to try to establish a more normal line of communication with Russia. So basically, they would have the ability to dial down the temperature and try to work around some of the most difficult obstacles, like the annexation of Crimea, and from a French perspective, Russia's growing involvement in Central African Republic and potential spoiler role in Mali and the Sahel. So it was really aimed at lowering the temperature and lowering the tensions. And Russia saw an opportunity from that to make France their kind of go-between or their kind of gateway into Europe. Also, with the Normandy format, the French wanted to play a larger role in the resolution of the Ukraine crisis from it. But in practice, there's been a lot of dialogue between France and Russia, which continued even during the Navalny poisoning last year on issues like Libya and cybersecurity and on a whole range of European security issues, but not very much in terms of an actual de-escalation of tensions so far.
Alena, I'm going to come to you in just a moment, give you a chance to think about this one, the approach of Eastern European countries compared to those in the West. But Tony, I want to come back to you and throw open this really rather wide question, which is it that Russia's deliberately putting on different faces for different people, or does it itself not actually know what it is at the moment?
Well, it clearly tries to divide the European Union. Russia focuses in its policy not on Brussels, but on the big players, on Paris, on Berlin, sometimes on Rome, and trying to play on the differences of interests of individual countries, and also trying to divide the transatlantic partnership, the US and the EU, and or the EU and the UK.
So it is actually being very it's being very smart in this, is your belief. It's not that it doesn't actually know quite what it stands for.
Well, it also doesn't know how to handle such a thing as the European Union, because it doesn't really understand what this is about, this kind of pooling of sovereignty, this kind of, in a Russian view, it's a kind of strange animal. They live in a kind of in a kind of Westphalian world of independent sovereign states and great powers. And there the EU simply doesn't fit. So they also don't know how to handle it.
So they then end up dealing with different capitals. I sort of get that. Alena, you believe, I think, that there is a way to repair this relationship. What do you think the route is?
Definitely the route starts with better understanding what each sides are striving for. I think in the West, there is also this conception that Russia wants to be a normal country. Normal in our Western understanding means that Russia wants to be like a Western country, which Russia might not necessarily want to. So everything that is done there needs to be taken a little bit from a different perspective. But also talking about repairing the roots, definitely there is expectation that certain behavior will be changed. But especially on the Russian side. Of course, Russia expects the European Union to change its behavior, but European Union's probably been more...
But isn't that a naivety? Because after Skripal, we had Navalny when it comes to poisoning. After Crimea, we've had the war in Ukraine, and we've had a recent troop build-up on the Ukrainian border. We've had interference in elections. We've had Russia supporting far-right groups, far-left groups. In some cases, the Greens. Russia's meddling and feeling that it can act with impunity is not likely to end, is it, Alena?
Definitely, and this builds up on what I was trying to say, is that we think that Russia wants to be nice and fluffy and Western, which is not the case, which means Russia understands much better the language of power, and the approaches of the European Union trying to reach out to Russia is taken as weaknesses. So maybe speaking more from a position of strength would change the dynamics a little bit. But also I'll get back to what you were saying about Russia being smart, but it also has to be noticed that Russia actually alienated quite a lot of actors in the European Union, because a lot of people who were even eager to work with Russia before now see that Russia is going too far, is pushing too brazenly against European counterparts, and Russia is losing its support also within the European
So
Union.
can I ask Samuel on that one? Why does Russia want to behave in this particular way? Is it simply because it wants to expand, to protect its borders? What do you think the reasoning for this is?
Well, I think that there's several different reasons. I mean, the first reason is that there's an institutionalized mistrust of Western institutions, such as NATO and the European Union, within the Russian elite establishment. And after the NATO expansion in Eastern Europe in the late 1990s and their perceived disrespect from Western powers in Kosovo and Libya, they want to make sure that never happens again. And the best way to roll back and push back against these powers is to show strength and assertiveness, which often translates into aggression. And I also think that there's a strong domestic political rationale, particularly in terms of public opinion, about creating a siege mentality at home and rallying people against Europe. Though, over the past few years, the plurality of Russians actually support engagement with Europe, according to recent polls, and only a minority support this current overly confrontational course.
Let's talk about a possible Biden-Putin summit and how might that reflect upon the European Union's intentions going forward. Tony, what do you make? It's obviously going to be symbolic. Is it going to be substantive? Are there going to be changes between the two? Is it going to be confrontational?
Well, I don't expect too many concrete results. It would be good if they would establish at least some form of dialogue again. And it will concentrate mostly on security, on stability issues. And of course, we expect from the Biden administration to also talk about international norms and principles and human rights, and how that affects not only Russia and our relations, but also the countries in between. So what Russia is doing in Ukraine, what Russia is doing with Belarus. So how far this conversation will produce results, I don't expect that to happen during the first summit. Just to establish some rules, to look for some forms of engagement, be it in dealing with consequences of climate change, being on the Arctic, maybe Middle East, but only some first, well, small initiatives.
Okay, so Samuel, do you think, I mean, to take the climate analogy just that little bit further, will the European Union be at all worried if the mood between Russia and the United States thaws at all?
I think that would definitely be a good thing for European security, because if there were to be a de-escalation of tensions with the United States, the Europeans would have more flexibility to engage with Russia on issues like Nord Stream 2, which already the U.S. has lifted the sanctions with temporarily. It would make it easier for a return to the JCPOA. It would make Russia less likely to engage in brinkmanship in Ukraine and in the Baltic states.
Just for our viewers who don't follow these things that carefully, I'm just going to explain that Nord Stream 2 is a massive pipeline coming from Russia into the European Union, and the JCPOA is the Iran nuclear deal. Sorry to interrupt, but carry on.
Of course, yeah. So it would make a whole bunch of issues easier, right? Like the Iran nuclear deal, the pipeline, and also just dial down the temperature of brinkmanship in Eastern Europe and prevent NATO from engaging in the kind of drills that Russia tends to overreact to. So I think the Europeans would welcome any kind of de-escalation, but I don't see it really happening in a large-scale way at all.
This is where I was going to go to you, Alena, and ask you. You believe that Eastern European countries, maybe even Central Eastern, have been warning Western countries about Russia's intentions. If there were to be an easing of tensions between the European Union as a bloc and Russia, would the eastern part of the European Union be concerned?
Definitely, it depends on which conditions. Easing for the sake of easing is not necessarily the desired outcome. It really depends on what are the foundations of this easing. But also what's important to understand about Central European countries, it's not a monolithic bloc. There are different countries in the region, and the perspective towards Russia range from being rather friendly to very disillusioned. So again, there is a scope of possibilities also in the region. What would be important also for Central Europeans is to make sure that there are certain basics that are upheld. For example, definitely there should be no talk about the military action anywhere close to the border. I don't think that NATO is involved in any brinkmanship. NATO is not doing anything particularly disturbing or nothing that hasn't been done before that would justify the Russian reactions. Of course, Russia is using it for its own purposes. But also for Central European countries, would be important to make sure that there is more consolidated Western coordination on issues like, for example, cybersecurity or disinformation operations, all wrapped up currently in this term hybrid threats. And here, the cooperation with the United States and European Union would be crucial.
Tony, all this, of course, reflects on business, makes it more difficult for international companies to do business in either Russia or in the European Union if you happen to be Russia. Is there any kind of danger that it could get so serious that there could be major economic repercussions? And could the European Union use any business leverage here?
Well, the European Union clearly has more business leverage than the United States. And especially energy relations. But one should also look at in financial services, all this Russian money going abroad, being in the city of London or in the US. And I think there Russia has got something to worry about. Not only US sanctions, which can be more effective, much more effective than European sanctions, but also that the Biden administration intends to go after all kind of illicit financing. And a lot of those funds may come from Russia. So I think there, if the US and the EU can combine forces, you have quite a lot of leverage in the business sphere. And at the moment you have a very weak European strategy. We have 5 so-called principles for the relations with Russia, which have to be updated now and made more effective.
Well, so my question at the beginning was, what about the inaction we've seen since 2019, probably earlier, and today? Is Russia in the slightest bit worried about any kind of retaliatory action that it is seeing from the European Union at the moment? And what could the EU do as a bloc to make Russia perhaps a little bit more concerned?
Well, if it concerns energy relations and things like Nord Stream, yes, they are concerned. If it's about financial services, they were concerned before that they may be cut off from the SWIFT international finance system. So yes, there is kind of leverage, not only on the regime, but also on the individual oligarchs supporting the regime.
Okay, Alena, do you want to follow up on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I would also say that the very fact that Russia relies so much on lobbying in the European Union and tries to lobby heavily against sanctions imposed on Russia, it also signifies that for Russia, they are not insignificant. Definitely, Russia is trying to survive. They're developing their own financial systems and technology that can help them obviate the economic sanctions or financial sanctions. But still, Russia is very far from achieving success in this area. So I absolutely agree with Tony about going after the money and focusing also on what is framed as a good governance within the European Union and the United States itself, targeting the dirty flows of money, which does not necessarily have to be anti-Russian. It can be any anti-dirty money that is out there.
The same question for you, Samuel, in just a moment. But Alena, how will we know, other than reading the newspaper headlines, whether things are getting better or worse?
You can see that for the even diplomatic relations between the countries, but also about you can see how the economic relations are developing. Public opinion in Russia should not be disregarded as well and should be carefully monitored by the European Union and other Western counterparts.
Samuel, will it be easy to see whether things are on the mend or not?
I think that certainly, obviously, the benchmarks that you look at, it would be frequency of engagement, particularly even though between France and Germany, there's been actually quite a lot of engagement over the past couple of years and hasn't really resulted in much, but we should watch for that. We should watch for certainly movements on the trade and investment sphere, and also public opinion as well, because as I said earlier, 46% of Russians now, according to some Levada Center surveys, want engagement with Europe, and only 43% see it as an enemy. So that number grows. Maybe the Russian government will be less inclined to rally anti-EU sentiments for its own regime consolidation purposes.
Tony, do you believe that things... Oh, yeah, please, Alena, yeah.
I just wanted to follow up on this issue of engagement. We emphasize a lot the frequency of the diplomatic engagement or with the high-level officials from Kremlin, but it's also important to understand that the government in Russia is not monolithic either. There are different groups there, different people with different interests. So it's important also to engage with a diverse set of representatives, both in the government structures, but also within what is broadly called civil society, starting from research institutions to universities to media organizations.
It's in everybody's long-term interest, Tony, surely, that the relationship is mended to some extent, but it'll never be the same again.
No, that's true. And we should try to manage. It will be partly conflictual and partly we will be looking for, well, small baby steps to at least have a reasonable conversation about some topics where we might agree eventually.
A new Cold War?
We won't go back to this partnership and cooperation agreement based on common values and all that. That's over.
Okay, sorry, you probably didn't hear me, but I'll throw it to Samuel instead. A new Cold War, what do you think?
I think that risk was always overblown, I think, from the very beginning. I mean, it was pretty clear that in 2014, by the middle of it, that Russia had failed in Novorossiya to really extend into eastern Ukraine. And the NATO deterrent probably made it unlikely that they would intervene in the Baltic states. So a major escalation of that kind of prolonged systemic confrontation was always overblown. And right now, if there's a new Cold War, it would probably be directed towards China because of the power asymmetries are just too large to really justify that, even if some of the mistrusts and ideational frictions are there.
Alena, neighbours who just don't understand one another rather than are openly hostile would seem to be the way it is at the moment.
Indeed so, but also I agree with the comment about that the Cold War situation is now rather unimaginable, at least because Russia knows that it has very little chance to succeed in this full systemic confrontation. What is Russia doing well currently? Well, by standards of achieving its own foreign policy and domestic goals, is this hybrid type of warfare where Russia is doing little damage here and there, where Russia is working with the public opinion. But this is not the type of confrontation that existed there during the Cold War. So indeed, neighbors that sometimes occasionally do some damage to each other without engaging into a full-blown war is something that we can see in the future.
Tony, just a quick one, because we don't have much more than a minute. Will it have to wait until Vladimir Putin goes for things to get better, if he ever does?
Well, he can stay on in principle till 2036 or something like that. He may go before that, but we should clearly watch the current electoral cycles. Russia has got Duma elections coming up in September. The same for, Germany will have elections in September. Macron's presidency is up for grabs early next year. So this all plays a role in the, and Russia may be calculating to see what kind of new forces may come up in either Berlin or Paris, and it may be not to their advantage if you're looking at German opinion polls, for example.
Listen, thank you very, very much indeed. Fascinating times or frightening times, depends how you look upon it. And we thank you very much indeed for giving us your thoughts today on this round table. Thank you for taking part, and thank you wherever you happen to be for watching. There's plenty more on our YouTube channel. That's TRT World Roundtable on YouTube. From me, David Foster, from the team that makes this possible every single time, we thank you for your company and hope to have it next time. Until then.